praise thy name. And that's what Psalm 105 that we're going to look at today is really all about. It's about God's works. Now, two things happen over and over in the Bible. God's people sin. God tells them they've sinned and asks them to repent, and if they do, he forgives them. And the other thing that happens over and over is the telling of the story of the Exodus and other great things that God has done. And that's one of the things that happens in this psalm. So it's about the history of deliverance. And when we look at Psalm 105, we look back at all the things, or many of the things that God has done. And it helps us to remember how great he is and to remember his creation. So I'm going to say a few things as we go. Daryl and Caroline are going to read the psalm. You'll have to take our word for it because you're not going to be able to see it. But let's start looking at verses 1 to 4, and these simply celebrate the greatness of our God.
Give praise to the Lord. Proclaim his name. Make known among the nations what he has done. Sing to him. Sing praise to him. Tell of all his wonderful acts. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord and his strength. Seek his face always.
Verses 5 to 11 carry on from there, and they focus on God's chosen people and the covenant that God made with them and about the land of Canaan. So let's hear from Daryl about these things.
Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles, and the judgment he pronounced. You, his servants, the descendants of Abraham, his chosen ones, the children of Jacob. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the promise he made for 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham, the oath he swore to Isaac. He confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as the everlasting covenant. To you, I will give you the land of Canaan as the portion you will inherit.
Okay, that takes us up to verse 11, and then there's a big section in the middle of this psalm from 12 up to 41, which goes over and summarises all of this history again. It looks at the lives of the patriarchs, Adam, Isaac and Jacob, and then there's the story of Joseph and the time of Egypt. Then it looks at the Exodus, the 10 plagues, and the time spent wandering in the wilderness. I'm sure you all know that story very well, so we won't read all of those verses, but we'll jump now to verse 42 and read 42 to 45. And this is the final settlement of Canaan. And listen to the last verse for the reason for all of this history, the reason why we've been told all this history.
For he remembered his holy promise given to his servant Abraham. He brought out his people with rejoicing, his chosen one with shouts of joy. He gave them the lands of the nations, and they fell heir to what others had toiled for, that they might keep his precepts and observe his laws. Praise the Lord.
Thank you, Susan. Now, John verse 44 says that they might keep his precepts and observe his laws. Now, this is really important. They are obedient, not because they're going to get into trouble, but they're obedient because they have been redeemed. And obedience is the result of this redemption. It's not that they're good, we're not good. And so, they are redeemed, just as we are redeemed. Now, you might like silently in your hearts as we move along here, okay, to pray that some of the technical issues might be worked out here. But for now, we're going to skip the next song, and I'll have to get back here to my running sheet to see what that means, because I knew we were going to a song. That means we're going to kids' time. And here's Susan.
No kids.
There's a couple of kids. Yes, they're kids.
These kids have been working very hard today. They set all the chairs up in the hall. So when you go out for morning tea, you're sitting on a chair that Elizabeth or Ezra's put there for you. So thanks, guys, for what you do to serve in the church, even though your children okay. Now, we were talking this morning about all the places that you've lived in. Would you like to tell people where you've lived? Is this on? Is it on?
I can't tell when you got two mics. What colour? Try that.
This is a challenging day, isn't it? Okay, Elizabeth's going to tell me and I'm going to bellow it out to you. Where have you lived, Elizabeth? First of all, Virginia. What country is Virginia in?
Oh, something's on.
America. Excellent. Then you went from Virginia to Las Vegas, that's number 2. Then Kenya in what country? In Africa, that's number 3.
Try it again.
Then Hawks. Then Hawks Nest. And then Hawks Nest. Then Tea Gardens. And then there's another one coming up a bit later on, isn't there? Wow.
That's okay.
Who's lived? That's 5 places, guys. Who's lived in more than 5 places in their lives? Not many.
I don't know if it will.
Guys, there's about 4
Yeah,
hands
financial
up.
project.
You've lived in more places than most people in church. Okay. And something special has happened. Something special has happened to the kids' church room, hasn't it? Ezra, you tell us what's happened. Big voice though. Who did that? A lot of people teach Sunday school or kids' church. Not many of them would take 3 days at least to paint it so it looks good for kids. So thank you very much for what you do. And she was ably assisted by.
We all did it together.
How do I say that? They did it together, Caroline and Daryl. So thank you everybody. We're going to pray for our children as they go out to their beautifully painted room. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your hand on the lives of Elizabeth and Ezra. Thank you for the way they were able to help the church this morning by putting all those chairs out. Thank you for the way that Carolyn and Anita and Chelsea and David
Is the
worked with our
project on
children,
right?
week by week by week, helping them to grow in the knowledge and love of you. So help Elizabeth and Ezra learn today as they go out to Kids Church, because we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, we come to a time of announcements now, and there's the regular announcements that we always have. We don't pass a plate, take up a collection in the church, but if you want to give to the work of the church, there's a little mailbox thing out there in the foyer where you can do that. After this service, we'll have morning tea in the hall, so we'd like everyone to join us for that.
This is showing us.
A special announcement today. If you haven't been put off by the bad luck of this morning, in 2 weeks, on Friday the 13th, there's a Seniors' Day out. So how brave are you feeling? If you want to go on a Seniors' Day out at Camp Ellen on Friday the 13th of March. If you'd like to, oh, geez, exciting, isn't it? If you'd like to, see Stuart, because he's the one who I understand knows all about it. Well, I think he's shaking his head a little bit. Oh yes, he's got the bit of paper now. Okay, so if you want to know more about it, see Stuart and he will arrange for you to get a ticket for that. Friday, the 13th of March, Seniors Day out at Camp Ellen. Now, this is where I relied heavily on the notice board up here, the slides, to tell me what other announcements we have. And so I'm a little bit in the dark. So I'm going to ask if there's anybody else who knows what announcement. I know Caroline does. Go.
World Day of Prayer is this year being hosted by the Uniting Churches on this Friday, and I believe it's 2:30. Yes. So be there or be square.
Wow. Anybody else who has an announcement or knows of something that should be announced? No? Okay. Well, in that case, we're going to go to a time of missionary. Now, Ellen is our missionary secretary, who is assisted by Georgina, and today Ellen is coming to talk to us. This will be the deal breaker one. Is the microphone working? Oh, no.
It's working, whichever one.
It's working.
Talking to it? Yeah, it's working.
This is working.
This one.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to talk to you this morning about Don and Shirl. I've had a letter from them, and they're doing really well. They're up in, or down in Tasmania or somewhere. But they're, for those that don't know, they're from this church and they travel up and down the coast doing maintenance and things with other churches along the way as Don's a builder. Now, they've had, Don had surgery on his knee and he's reported that that's getting much better, but now he's having trouble with his other knee. So we need to pray for his other knee. They went to Tasmania to do some more work and then they had to return to the mainland again. Don's father passed away and they weren't able to go to Queensland for his funeral, but it was relayed to them through Skype or something to that effect. So they were able to see it. Before they left, Don spent quite some time repairing their trailer and getting it all done up to go, and it was, I had some slides of pictures of it, but we haven't got it now, and it looked really good. But some time down there, some people took their trailer in the night. They were drug addicts and they trashed it. So their trailer was a bit of a mess. So I'm not quite sure what they're going to do about that, but we can pray for that.
It was his son's trailer.
Was it?
Yes.
Oh.
So I think it might have got some feedback on insurance.
Oh, well, that's good. I'm glad you know a bit more about it than I do. But they've sent quite a few pictures here of the work they do, and there's a picture of the trailer, how nice it looked before Don went on and fixed it up, and how it looks bad now. They were able to find it. It was not far away from where they were. Other than that, they're just travelling around and doing all their work. They've asked to pray for some more for Don's knee for healing and direction on who to help and what to do, and opportunities to share God as they travel or when they're in tea garden, the finances to continue their ministry, and not less heavy work because Don's not coping with the heavy stuff anymore, and guidance and finance to fix buses, exhaust brakes. So there must be a problem with exhaust brakes. So I'd just like us, we could pray for them, and I'll put all these papers out on the desk there, and if you want to read about them and see all the pictures of the work that they've done and are doing, it'll be out there on the desk. But dear Heavenly Father, we pray for Don and Cheryl that you'll protect them as they travel up and down the coast, Lord, on the roads, and also in the work that they're doing, because it's dangerous work being a builder, and especially when you've got one bad leg. So we pray that you will help them. and guide them and bring them back here safely, that they can tell us all their adventures and all the wonderful things that they have done for you. Thank you, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Send the
Well,
email.
I want to say three things before we go
Do
too
you,
much
do you want
further.
to try here and see if you
Because
can
it looks
or
like
just
we're
go
not going to be doing any
give it a try
songs,
because this one is
I suspect this service is going to finish a little bit early, so the people doing the kitchen might like to be aware of that. Secondly, we had a really flash presentation worked out here where Susan was going to give an introduction to to Mark, and then we're going to do a song that picked up those ideas, and then we're going to come back to the talk.
Oh,
yeah.
next week.
But not only is that sad, this is a preacher's worst nightmare because Susan has spent so many hours preparing the overheads that you should be
We
able
can
to
get
see
it.
now.
We can get it.
And you can do it?
Yeah, but just give us a bit more longer.
Play a song.
What a team.
Sing us a song. Song.
Do a
Just
song.
sing.
Can we do a song? Will we
Yeah,
have
do a
words?
song. Do a song and we'll enjoy it.
Do you have a PowerPoint of your... Do you have a USB of yours?
No. Doesn't matter, Len. We can
got
do
it.
all that.
I can do this. Just give me the PowerPoint. Give me
Let
the
me-
message.
Let me talk about Mark.
Why don't you talk about
Why
this?
don't you guys
We
sit
can
down?
go and
I've
sit
got
down.
words to the song.
Sing a song.
Do a song.
Yeah.
Just sing a song. Give us the...
Sing a song.
Would you like to sing a song?
Yes.
Okay, then.
What would you like to sing?
Here's the one for Gospel of Mark,
Okay.
and
It's on there?
I'm just trying to,
I'll get it to you on PowerPoint.
just trying to.
Oh, we know how to.
How deep the Father's love so.
We know how to.
And I think a lot of people will remember the words, and if not, you can just download
Enjoy it.
and listen to the words, because they're beautiful words. They're from 1 John chapter 3 verse 1 actually.
Yeah, I'm trying to save it to that.
What we call it was called Mark, isn't it?
Thank you.
Mark that I want to introduce you to. Mary, we won't read through the first part of the talk. When we get to the second part, I'll need you to do the Bible reading. So the second part of the talk. Okay? Thank you very much. Okay, Mark. There are a couple of verses that introduce us to him. First of all, from Acts 12, we read that his mum, Mary, had a big house in Jerusalem, big enough to hold the believers who gathered in Jerusalem. That was the home that Mark grew up in. And so, because the Church of Jerusalem gathered in that house, Mark would have had opportunity to meet all the believers, or many of the believers in Jerusalem. He would have rubbed shoulders with Peter and John, and later Paul. So we know a little bit about Mark's upbringing, which allows us to surmise that he had good contacts with the Christian community in Jerusalem. The other verse that's interesting is that people think that the Last Supper happened in the home of Mary in Jerusalem. And if Mark had been here, or in that house at the time, he perhaps heard what happened. Perhaps he heard some of the teaching that Jesus gave at that Last Supper. Perhaps he heard Judas's hurried footsteps on the stairs as he went off to betray Judas. Perhaps he saw the soldiers following when the disciples left the house and went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Perhaps he followed behind the soldiers. Perhaps he protested when the soldiers handled Jesus roughly. Perhaps, we're seeing a bit of a theme here, perhaps he put his hand out to protect Jesus and his hand fell victim to a Roman sword, because the early church knew John Mark as Mark the stump-fingered, perhaps from a Roman sword. We don't know any of that, but we do know that there was a young man who was following, and when the soldiers grabbed him, he fled naked. And many people think that was, many scholars think, many commentators think, that was John Mark. We're going to call, he was known as John and also Mark, and we're going to call him Mark because the gospel that he wrote is known as Mark. About 15 years after all of these events, Paul and Barnabas, who was Mark's uncle, set off on their first missionary journey, and they took with them Mark. And then something sad happened. We don't know why. The text doesn't tell us. But in Acts chapter 13 we read that when Paul and Barnabas got to Perga in Pamphylia, they left their island of Cyprus, where they'd had wonderful success with a Gentile ruler, and sailed across to Perga in Pamphylia, lowlands full of mozzies. We can identify with them this morning, full of mozzies, and the text just says Mark left them. We don't know why. People have wondered, maybe he got malaria from all the mozzies and was just too sick to keep going. Maybe he didn't agree then with what Paul's focus was increasingly becoming, which was a mission to the Gentiles. We don't know. But wonderfully, we do know that although Paul was quite upset and refused to take Mark on the second missionary journey, we do know that by the end of Paul's life, they were reconciled. You can find reference to that in Colossians and Philemon. And in the very last thing that Paul wrote, which was to Timothy, he says, "Send Mark to me, for he is useful to me." So in his last days, this was the guy that Paul wanted with him. So Mark's got quite an interesting story. So just to sum up that little introduction, he was the son of a widow Mary, in whose house the Last Supper may have been held. There's a lot of perhapses, but we can surmise with reasonable clarity that he wrote the gospel after listening to what Peter had to say about Jesus. There's lots of hints in there. Mark tells us some things that the other gospel writers don't about Peter. Mark omits some of the things where Peter did an almost heroic thing in some of the other gospels. Mark leaves those out, which would be in keeping with Peter's humility, wouldn't it? Okay. Mark's never been my favourite gospel. Yours? A lot of people like Matthew because Matthew tells us all about Israel and how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. And there's these 5 great chunks of fabulous teaching by Jesus in Matthew. And I really like Luke's gospel. It's the longest, has most parables, and I like the parables. And I really like Luke because he empathises so much with the people who are suffering, with women, with the poor, with children. So Luke's got a special place. I often turn to Luke when I want to read something about Jesus. And most of you will say, John is your favourite? Right, Dinah? Right, Sandy? John? Yes? Why? John's just so majestic, isn't he? Yeah. A lot of his language is very memorable. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It just rolls off your tongue beautifully, doesn't it? You like John. And you're probably very familiar with this. And then there's Mark. Quite honestly, I've only ever used Mark when I wanted to read a gospel with someone and quickly introduce them to Jesus, because it's short. It's only 16 chapters, and in fact, when we were putting the Pray Away Bibles out, then we had some questions from Mark to accompany them. So as people read the Bible, perhaps for the first time, there were some questions to guide them through their thinking as they read the Gospel of Mark. It's short. It's good. But as I've studied Mark this time, I really like it. I really like what's in Mark, and I hope we'll be able to have a look at some of the things that Mark does that the others don't. The idea that the Gospel writers were writing for different audiences has been around for a long time. And you see it in paintings like that, please. You see it in paintings like the one that was on the there. It was on this side. That you can see that Matthew is the lion down front, and he's also the lion in the carving. The Lion of Judah, because Matthew wrote for Jews. That's why he explains so much of the Old Testament. Mark is the ox. See the ox over here and down the front on the carving. The symbol that they use for Mark is the ox, the animal, the beast of burden, the animal of service. Because Mark writes about Jesus as the servant, and he wrote for Romans. So he wrote in a style that Romans would have liked. Simple, abrupt, sharp, quickly going from X to Y to Z. For a long time I didn't see any links. They just looked like isolated things that happened, and I wondered why Mark even bothered to order them that way. It didn't make sense to me. It does a bit more now. Luke is the man. See up in the top over here? And in the carving at the top, Luke was the friend of sinners, and he wrote for the Greeks. And then John, magnificent John, the eagle, because there's so much just sheer theology in John's Gospel, isn't there? And he wrote for the worldwide church. Now these ideas people have got for centuries and centuries and centuries from Revelation, which you'll see up on the screen shortly. From chapter 4 of Revelation we read, around the throne in heaven, were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and behind. The first living creature was like a lion. The second was like an ox. The third had a face like a man. And the fourth was like a flying eagle. So that's where this idea that the gospel writers represent different audiences comes from. Okay, can we go to the next slide? What we have there is the theme that we're going to be following for the 16 weeks of Mark, that Jesus came from heaven to serve the oxes, the beast of service, and he returned to heaven to serve. So how does Mark organise his material to bring this theme out? Let's have a look. Right in the middle of Mark's Gospel is a key verse, and you probably have memorised it. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. That's where our theme has been brought from. And so Mark organises his Gospel in an interesting way. There are 16 chapters, and the first 8 take about 3 years. And it's one long meandering journey through Galilee. And then there's 2 chapters that deal with a fairly quick journey to Jerusalem. And then the rest of Mark's Gospel is about what happened in Jerusalem in that last week. So 3 years in the first 8 chapters, 1 week in the last 8 chapters. Where do you think the emphasis is? On the end, isn't it? John is looking at Jesus as one who serves. Okay, moving on. Mark was writing at a time of crisis in Rome. Nero was the emperor, and you know about Nero, don't you? The first 5 or so years of his reign were good ones. He did a lot of building works. He cleaned up a lot of the slums. He organised for sewage and water to Rome. He was a good ruler for the first 5 or so years. And then he changed. And in the last years, he was a despotic tyrant. No other word for it. All the building works had ground to a halt for a couple of reasons. He ran out of money. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? He ran out of money. And so he started to terrorise the nobles in Rome. They were invited to banquets where they were given the opportunity to commit suicide at a banquet. It's really gross, isn't it? And it gets worse from there. Rumour has it that Nero wanted to burn down Rome, get rid of the slums, so he could start again and create a beautiful city that would be that would honour him. And so rumour was circulating that Nero actually started the Great Fire of Rome in 64. It destroyed 4/5 of Rome, completely flattened it. For those of us who have watched bushfires and shared the terror through the television of the bushfires, we know what that looks like, don't we? We've seen that kind of devastation from fire. And that's what Rome was like, around about 64. We have the next one. So Nero found a scapegoat. He blamed the Christians. He said they were the ones that did it. And people believed it because, you see, the Christians were becoming increasingly unpopular because they refused to take part in the trade guild dinners. They felt that they were compromising their worship of God because at these trade guild dinners, pagan gods were worshipped because each guild had its own pagan god as kind of a, what's the word, thing that they followed. So, like a mascot, thank you, that's the word I'm looking for. So, the Christians couldn't go to these trade guild dinners because the mascot was worshipped, and so the Christians became unpopular. And when Nero said, the Christians started the Great Fire, even though that I'm sure wasn't true, they were believed, he was believed, and the Christians were persecuted. So Mark's Gospel was a response to that persecution. the church, for the first time really, knew persecution, and Mark wrote to people who were undergoing that. We can tell there's little hints all the way through Mark's Gospel that that's what he's doing. For example, Mark, 3 of the Gospel writers talk about the temptation in the wilderness. Takes Matthew and Luke to their chapter 4 before they get to it. Mark got there in 12 verses. Abrupt, simple account of the temptation. But he slips in a little phrase. He says, Jesus was among the wild animals in the wilderness. And the commentators have suggested that that would be great comfort to the Christians who were facing in the arena the wild animals. Chapter 13, Jesus is warning them about coming persecution. So Mark was writing with a pastor's heart to the Christians in Jerusalem. He wanted them to know that Jesus understood, that Jesus had been there, done that, and was with them in the midst of this persecution. Okay? So, that's a quick introduction to Mark's Gospel. I just want to read you what Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote about the persecution of the Christians. You've probably seen movies where it's portrayed, but just listen to these. Tacitus was writing about a generation later than Mark, and he says, large numbers of Christians were condemned, not so much for incendiarism as for their antisocial tendencies. Their deaths were made farcical. Dressed in wild animal skins, they were torn to pieces by dogs, or crucified, or made into torches to be ignited after dark. The victims were pitied, for it was felt they were being sacrificed to one man's brutality, that's Nero's brutality, rather than to the national interest. So it was into a very precarious situation that Mark was writing. So he's not writing as a journalist, just telling us the events of Jesus' life. He's writing to draw us into the text, to make us understand what it was like, to help us love and worship the main character, Jesus. So if, like me, you've ignored Mark till now, then be prepared to be surprised by our studies over the next few weeks, because there's a lot more in Mark than perhaps many of us realise. If it's been a while since you got excited about reading a gospel, then perhaps our studies in Mark will rekindle your enthusiasm, your excitement about having in your own hand an account of the stories of your Lord and Saviour. If you have never really got to know Jesus, then perhaps in the pages of Mark's Gospel you'll see Jesus. If you've never really understood how much he loves you, then perhaps in the pages of Mark's Gospel you will see that. So now, and I put some smiley Jesuses up, because we often just portray Jesus as the man on the cross, don't we? The suffering Saviour of the world. And indeed he was that. And Mark gives us 8 chapters to focus on that. But there are 8 chapters before that. 8 chapters where we see this Jesus, the Jesus that people love, that children love, the Jesus who could talk about an abundant life because he was modelling it. That's the Jesus that we will see as we start the Gospel of Mark. Okay, we're not going to stop for the song, we're going to go straight into the Gospel of Mark. Okay, there's the theme for the whole book. Jesus came from heaven to serve and returned to heaven to serve. That's the theme for the 16 weeks of Mark. And today we're looking at the good news begins. And Mary is going to read to us the first 3 verses of Mark's Gospel.
The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him.
Thank you, Mary. Okay. When the Emperor Augustus, the baby who became the Emperor Augustus, was born, the good news of that, the gospel, was sent out throughout the Roman Empire because it was 1, historical, and 2, significant. The birth of that baby was going to change history, so it was really important. That's the gospel, the euangelion word, that Christians started using for the good news of Jesus Christ. And indeed, it is a gospel that focuses on the death and resurrection of Jesus as a fulfillment of God's plan to reconcile sinful people to a holy God. That's the gospel. But at this stage, people didn't know about the cross and resurrection, did they? So the gospel had this undercurrent of 1, it's significant, it's going to change history, and 2, it's historical. So significant, historical, as well as the overcovering idea of the gospel as God's plan to reconcile sinful people to himself. Does that make sense? Mark starts with it, it's in his verse 1, and it's also at the end of his gospel. Mark bookends the story, the accounts of Jesus between this idea of gospel. By the end of Mark's gospel, we understand a lot more about what it meant. And Mary read to us 3 verses from the Old Testament that told us about a messenger that was going to precede Jesus, about John the Baptist. And Mark includes these, not at the length that some of the other gospel writers do, but very, very briefly, succinctly, abruptly, because he wants to show us that Jesus had the very best credentials. Matthew and Luke take 4 chapters to tell us that. Mark is there by the end of verse 3. See how St. Mark's condensing things, leading us straight into the life of Jesus. Now we're going to skip verses 4 through to 20. We're going to skip 16 verses, but I want to just show you one thing about those verses. They're the verses that deal with the baptism of Jesus and the temptation of Jesus. But interestingly enough, Mark uses the word immediately, or words that mean that at once, as soon as. The concept of immediately, he uses that 4 times in those 16 verses. It's as though Mark's hurrying us through the events in the life of Jesus. He uses that word or words that mean the same thing, because some of it gets changed in translation, doesn't it? He's using the idea of immediately 40 times in the gospel. It's really an emphasis. Mark is hurrying us on. He also uses a present historical tense rather than a past. Instead of saying Jesus did this, he said Jesus does this, to kind of bring us in. We're there with him. We're involved in what's going on. And we're seeing the purposefulness. Jesus is not really hurrying. Jesus wasn't in a hurry, was he? He did things as the time was right. But Mark is kind of speeding us through Jesus' purpose, getting us to those last 8 chapters that deal with the cross. So as you'll read Mark's Gospel, as you prepare yourself for these series of talks, just notice the word immediately. I started circling it as I was reading it, and it really is an emphasis of Mark's. But let's move on, please, to verse 21 of Mark, and Mary's going to read.
They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then, a man in his synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, What do you want to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.
Thanks, Mary. Notice that this happens in a synagogue, this encounter. Jesus has gone to synagogue and that's where this happens. And it's on the Sabbath. And that's going to become a recurring idea through Mark's Gospel too. Jesus does things on the Sabbath and the scribes and the Pharisees do not approve. Very clearly from the very beginning, they do not approve, and that becomes a major thing in Mark's Gospel. We read that the people were amazed at his teaching. Well, of course you'd be amazed if this were Jesus here teaching us. It would be amazing, wouldn't it? But Mark makes a special effort to let us know how people felt about what was going on. So this was amazing that Jesus, the son of a carpenter, would teach with such authority. When they compared him to their teachers, the teachers of the law, he was way more authoritative. And Jesus is accosted by a man who has an impure spirit or a demon. My older version used to say, this man had a demon. Okay? Notice what the demon says. The demon knows who Jesus was. See? He calls him two things. What are they? Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was a real man, but he's also the Holy One of God. Jesus was really God. The demon gets that. Mary, can we have the next slide, please?
Be quiet, said Jesus sternly. Come out of him. The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. But people, also amazed, and they asked one another, what is this? A new teaching? And with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him. News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee.
You can see that the demons know that this is a fight to the death because the man screams and shakes violently. It's a violent encounter. This is not a ho-hum thing. It's a very serious, impactful encounter between Jesus and an impure, satanic demon that's going to culminate in the cross. So you'll notice that this is something I've only just started to think about, and I'm not sure I've got it sorted in my thinking yet. Perhaps you can tell me what you think. First of all, demons are cast out. Just remember the wording. Demons are cast out. Let's move on, John. Thanks, Mary.
But others healed and freed. Do you want that bit too? As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about it. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who were ill and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was.
The demons did, didn't they? Yeah. Notice immediately, that's another one of the occasions of this word. There's a lot made about Simon's mother-in-law. She hadn't done anything to deserve special attention from Jesus. She was just there and suffering, and Jesus healed her. But what happens next is significant. What does she do? She gets up and waits on them, serves them. There's that theme of Jesus serving coming through again. But notice the bit in red at the bottom. Jesus healed many who had various diseases. So demons are cast out, but diseases or people with diseases are healed. Why the different language? Okay, let's move on. Thanks, Mary.
Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so that I can preach there too, That is why I have come." So he travelled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons.
Mark is very clear, because Jesus was very clear, that he didn't come to heal. His ministry is not all about fixing up people who are suffering. He often does that, and the Bible often talks about Jesus' compassion for people who are suffering. But Jesus is very clear. His purpose was a message. He came to preach. Okay? Mary, please.
A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed.
Demons are cast out, people with sickness are healed, and now leprosy is cleansed. 3 different words. It's interesting, isn't it? What do you know about leprosy? It's a terrible, terrible disease that affected the skin and the nerves. And if you had leprosy, then you were sent away from the town. That was for 2 reasons. It was for hygienic reasons, because leprosy, true leprosy, there are other varieties of sin disease that they thought was leprosy, no, that wasn't. But people with true leprosy were very contagious. So they were not allowed to live where other people. They were sent away from their families, from their homes, from their community, from their synagogue. So leprosy was a terrible thing. In enacting that, being sent away from everything that they knew, everything that was familiar, was the idea that leprosy was a sign of moral uncleanness. They treated it as quite different from an ordinary disease. They said that people who were morally unclean and who had therefore been rejected by God couldn't come into the community. Leprosy was a sign of moral uncleanness and God's judgment. So the man was really risking quite a lot when he came to Jesus and asked for healing. It's interesting that he starts off, "If you are willing." Perhaps the man felt that even Jesus wouldn't be willing to heal someone with leprosy because it was a sign of moral uncleanness. So demons are cast out, sick people are healed, people with leprosy are cleansed. We have quite different pictures of the one thing, pictures of sin. Think about it for a moment. What other pictures of sin are there in the Bible? I'm glad it's taken you a while. It took me a while to think about it too. I think slavery, Paul uses the idea of slavery as a picture of sin, doesn't he? Jesus uses the idea of leaven as a picture of sin. There are others in the Bible. Paul uses the idea of death as a picture of sin. So sin is just not something simple. We were talking about this at Bible study last Tuesday, that we don't perhaps take sin as seriously as we might. When you think about the way Jesus has enacted his response to sin, then perhaps we might take it a bit more seriously too. Be a bit more careful as we sin and go to Jesus to deal with it. Demons are cast out. Some sin needs to be cast out of our lives. Some people are healed of diseases, and leprosy are cleansed. When you're sinned against you, you feel dirty. I worked with young people who were abused, and they said they felt so dirty. They wanted to be, you know, their first act after the abuse was to want to have a shower. They felt dirty. They needed to be cleansed. Demons, illness, leprosy, all different pictures of sin that Mark is giving us in this very first chapter when he's introducing Jesus to us. You see that same language. Go back to the Matthew one. You'll see the same language many, many times. In fact, I started looking through the New Testament to see if different words were used, and they're not. See, in Matthew 10, we've got the kingdom of heaven has come, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. See, the same language is used, different writer, different occasion. When John the Baptist sent his disciples to Jesus to say, are you really the one that is to come? Are you really the Messiah? Jesus answered, look what I'm doing. Jesus was giving people a chance to see that he was the Messiah by doing things. He was giving the rulers of the synagogue, the people in the synagogue in Rome, the chance to see that he was God. So let me just quickly summarise. You thought you were getting out early, didn't you? Okay, summary of chapter 1. The good news begins. The gospel is the good news about the great salvation achieved by Jesus, which reconciles sinful people to a holy God, but it is historical and significant. It really happened and it changed the world. That's how the word was used. Okay? Jesus' purpose was to serve. How? By preaching the gospel, and he demonstrated that gospel by healing people with sicknesses, casting out demons, and cleansing from leprosy. So thank you very much for listening through all that. Next week, chapter 2. Oh, it gets better and better. John, over to you.
Well, it's not quite time to go, so we thought we'd play you one last song, because Jesus did come to serve, and that serving cost him greatly. But it's from the shedding of his blood that we benefit. Some of you will know this song, because it's an old song. The tune is a new one, and if you know the words, please sing along with us. This is nothing but the blood of Jesus. Sorry. Well, now we're on again. Now we are running a little bit late, so please join us for morning tea out there and go in peace to love and serve the Lord Jesus.